Thank you very much, Professor Morgan. I am grateful both to you and to Amalia Kakisis, the activist of the British School at Athens, for giving me the opportunity to study at the Byzantine Archives of the school as a project assistant, as Professor Morgan has mentioned. My lecture today is based largely on the results of my research. On the 10th of September 1881, William Morris was invited to give a lecture at the Working Men's College at Great Ormond Street, central London. The adult education institution was founded by Christian socialists in 1854 and supported by the likes of Dante Gabriele Rossetti, John Ruskin, and John Stuart Mill. Morris' lecture, which was entitled Some Hints on Pattern Designing, focused on the examination for, I quote, the benefit of man in times of degradation of the best of the decorative arts. Summing up, Morris concludes that such an art should fulfill 6 criteria. It should be something easily accessible, as you can see on the slide, beautiful, inspiring, something that reminds us of life beyond life, and last but not least, something that can be done and understood without much difficulty by a great many people and with pleasure. After a brief examination of the development of major historical artistic styles in an attempt to trace such an art, Morris reaches stage 5 of his research, the last one, which is greater than at first sight it may seem to you, part of the change in art from late and decaying classical into Byzantine, or, as I would rather call it, newborn Gothic, a sudden liberating leap from death to new life, new birth. My lecture today aims to explore the various perceptions of Byzantium and its art by the followers of the arts and crafts movement in Britain. I will particularly focus on the research and work of the arts and crafts architects of the so-called Byzantine Research Fund archive, which is housed here in Athens at the British School. But what was considered Byzantine by Morris, the founders, and later the followers of the arts and crafts movement? What made them turn to the study of Byzantine art? What was actually their experience of it? What they had actually seen from the art of the Byzantines? How far their perception of this art differs than that of their contemporaries? In examining the issue, I hope to revisit some aspects of the modern movement's attitude towards the past, as well as to illuminate Byzantine's modernism. It was around the end of the 19th century that Byzantium first entered the cultural limelight as a subversive precedent for modernity's escape from classicism. John Ruskin and William Morris, legendary figures of the arts and crafts movement, first turned to Gothic art. Both were pioneers in teaching Victorian audiences to appreciate the Gothic. Although Ruskin did not venture further than Venice, in his landmark Stones, published between 1851 and 1853, particularly the chapter The Nature of Gothic, he argued convincingly for the social, moral, and artistic collapse of his contemporary art and promoted the Gothic as the manifestation of the integrity, honesty, and autonomy of the true artist and craftsman. Morris himself was both an artist and a designer. He intensified the essence of Ruskin ideas and further promoted the Gothic as providing the foundations for the moral and aesthetics of the arts and crafts movement. He particularly promoted the unity of craftsmanship and design, aiming to simplify high-standard design in order to make it accessible to larger audiences, keeping at the same time costs down. But how did he turn to Byzantine art? Byzantium during that period was still largely identified, both in the continent as well as in Britain, with manuscript illumination and the mosaic cycles of Ravenna and Rome. Even the adventurous Lord Lindsay, who travelled as far as St. Catherine's Monastery, at Mount Sinai, one of the most risky journeys for the period, concluded in his Sketches of a History of Christian Art that St. Mark in Venice is the glory of Byzantium. Was actually Europe acquainted with Byzantine works other than manuscripts and the Italian mosaics? In 1847, in Paris, in one of the famous Parisian saloons, the French painter Dominique Louis Paris exhibited his copies of old paintings from Mount Athos. The painter, who died of cholera unexpectedly young, aged 34, had visited Mount Athos between April and August 1846. He painted mainly the fresco cycles in the monasteries of the Great Lavra and the Votato. The exhibition of his drawings in the Paris Saloon acquainted for the first time European audiences with large-scale Byzantine decorative works other than the mosaic. Here you can see a publication of these drawings in an art historical periodical of the period. Artists, as well as the wider public, responded to the Byzantine works exhibited in Paris with unexpected enthusiasm. In 1857, the German architect Wilhelm Salzenberg published chromolithographed color prints produced by lithography by the architect brothers Giuseppe and Gaspare Fossati from the Cathedral of St. Sophia in Constantinople. William Morris was one of the first to own a copy of the book. We do not know if this was the first time that he had the opportunity to study closely a work of Byzantine art outside Italy and Venice. However, allegedly, this very publication strengthened his enthusiasm for the artistic production of Byzantium. Morris befriended architectural historians such as James Ferguson, who had studied in depth Byzantine monuments in the East. In the lecture he delivered in 1889 in the at the Arts and Crafts Exhibition Society, an offspring of the Art Workers Guild, a union that was founded to further promote the philosophies of the new movement, Morris stated firmly that nothing more beautiful than the best Byzantine works has ever been produced by man. But how far Byzantine was in fact what he had seen? These late 19th century reproductions were heavily influenced by the traditional aesthetic principle of the period, that the viewer should be moved by the impact not of the relic, but of the masterpiece. Executed by artists, they were widely copied and offered, in fact, a neoclassical reading of Byzantine art, more familiar and appealing to large European audiences. Here you can see Fossati's reproductions from the mosaic of St. Sophia, here. And there you see another reproduction of that very, the Fossati drawings that was published by Weir in his, the French, Charles Weir, in his History of Byzantine Art. Aligned with the predominant neoclassicism, these drawings emphasize the similarities of Byzantine art to classical art, rather than the uniqueness of its character and aesthetic values. And as I've mentioned, these drawings were widely copied. Here you see another copy of the same drawing for another art historical book for a Greek scholar called Mavrogiannis in his History of Byzantine Art, and another one by Spiridon Lambros. So we're having a successive series of reproductions of the same, in fact, drawing. Morris was among the first in Britain to turn his interest to Byzantine monuments other than the churches of Ravenna and Rome. His appreciation of monuments of the Byzantine world outside Italy and Venice gave Byzantium a global significance. He was now convinced that the art of the Byzantines was one of the last manifestations, according to his lectures, of great, the best, to follow his exact words, art. He responded strongly to it, as himself explained in his Working Men's Scholars lecture, due both to its potential for fantasy as well as its practical possibilities. Morris was an artist and craftsman. He was also an active socialist, a particularly important ideology for the arts and crafts followers. For Morris, the anonymous Byzantine craftsmen, untainted by individualism, acted and created as instruments of a society that knew no division into intellectual castes. Morris could describe Byzantine art as popular, a revolt against the academic and the classical that managed though to retain a deeper meaning as a visual symbol. For a cooperative movement organized into guilds, the medieval and Byzantine artists who tended to form similar unions constitute the ideal example. Influenced by Morris' ideas about the character of true art and its relation to politics and the everyday, a group of British architects founded in 1884 the Art Workers Guild. The main principle of the newly founded guild was to introduce the philosophy and aesthetic principle of the arts and crafts into applied architecture. Among the founding members of the guild was the architect and architectural historian William Richard Lethaby. Lethaby, a personal friend of Morris and a supporter of the arts and crafts ideas, was among the first in Britain to legitimize Byzantine art in the Eastern Mediterranean. Indeed, his monograph on the Church of St. Sophia in Constantinople, a landmark publication, which appeared in collaboration with the fellow architect Harold Swanson in 1894, illustrated and popularized Byzantine art in the East. The preface of the book expresses arguably more succinctly than any of his other writings Lethaby's interest in Byzantine architecture. As you can see here in the preface of the book, he explains why he turned to Byzantine architecture, why he studied St. Sophia. So he explains that he turned to the art of Byzantium because the modern architect should study the universal style of the Byzantines. Only thus, he states, his work, the work of the architect, can be reasonable, and if reasonable, like theirs, universal. William Lethaby had quickly worked his way up from an early apprenticeship with a local architect to his appointment as chief clerk to Richard Norman Shaw, the Royal Academy architect of the new Scotland Yard building. Richard Norman Shaw himself was an advocate of the arts and crafts principles. His architecture, avoiding the current academic styles, promulgated in fact the arts and crafts philosophy. The 5 founding members of the Art Workers Guild were all working as assistants to his office. In January 1884, Robert Weir Schultz was taken on as an apprentice in Norman Shaw's London office. The next year, he was admitted to the Royal Academy. 3 years later, in 1887, he won the Royal Academy Gold Medal and Travelling Studentship. Contemporary of Weir Schultz at the Academy was Sidney Howard Barnsley. Barnsley, however, did not meet with Weir Schultz at the institution during that time. He met with Schultz in 1886, when he also went to work in the office of Norman Shaw. Their acquaintance with the chief assistant there, William Lethaby, would have a profound effect on their careers. The careful and serious study of historical buildings was considered essential by pioneers of the arts and crafts movement. If you want to learn architecture, you must study architecture, that is architectural construction, underlined Lethaby in a short essay on the qualification and training of the architect, which appeared in a collective volume on architecture, co-edited in 1992 by Richard Norman Shaw and Thomas Graham Jackson, himself a major figure of the late Victorian architectural scene and master of the Art Workers Guild. Lethaby's interest in architectural history led to his involvement in the Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings, which was actually founded by Morris himself. Lethaby had traveled around the Near East, as well as Thessaloniki and Constantinople, studying surviving Byzantine heritage. It was on Lethaby's advice that the two Royal Academy architects traveled to Greece and the Near East for a first-hand view of Byzantine architecture. Greece was by far an unknown destination for the period travelers. In fact, Hellenism was particularly linked to the artistic values of Victorian society. The arts and crafts followers soon developed an interest in local, mainly Oriental cultures. The Eastern Mediterranean, the Holy Land, and the Near East fascinated the revolutionary artistic minds of the era, establishing British Orientalism. And here you see one of a painting by one of the major representatives of the movement, David Robbins. They particularly focused in rehabilitating the study of the Greek past and the nation's folk cultural heritage. Two were the London-based bodies closely associated with the arts and crafts movement that organized during the period expeditions to the Near East, Asia Minor, and the Eastern Mediterranean: the Twin Travelers Club and the Art Workers Guild. However, both were seeking mainly to investigate classical Greece. Philhellenism, which in its early form grew out of the expressive range of late 18th century Romanticism, was largely responsible for that. The Philhellenes of the period developed further the academic study of antiquity, which was formalized by the dilettanti and the 18th century grand tourists. With the aid of new technical developments of the period, they focused almost exclusively on the classical remains of Greece, developing a growing interest in the modern Greek reality and its people. And here you see Edwin Lear recording the Acropolis, and also Greeks in their traditional costumes. By contrast, approaches to post-antique monuments were rather looser, more subjective, and varied. In fact, Byzantine, Venetian, Frankish, and Ottoman architecture and art were seen as somewhat exotic and in constant dialogue with the more familiar classical past. Here you see some Byzantine monuments at the very at the background here. You have here the Agora and then the Christian churches at the background. And here you see a monastery, the monastery of Maritza, depicted in an isolated in a landscape that is almost like deserted. I mean, you can see nothing here. In an exotic, we can say, landscape, which of course is unreal. It's not true. The search for an identity for the newly formed independent Greek state, the idea of continuity that dominated the socio-political debates of the era, the expansion and development of historical studies in Europe, the establishment of Byzantine history and literature as independent academic disciplines, led in fact to the reappraisal of surviving Byzantine architecture and art in a Greece dominated by neoclassicism and almost haunted by its classical past. Schultz and Barnsley, following the example of their mentor Lethaby, were pioneers in revisiting Byzantium through the remains of Byzantine Greece. Driven by the strong nationalistic interest that typically characterized the arts and crafts followers, they challenged established itineraries, visiting remote regions. They visited Greece twice, briefly passing through Italy on their first visit. Initially, on their first trip, 1888 to 1889, they focused on Athens and the Peloponnese. Through a special appeal and a contribution from the British School Committee, £250 was raised. This allowed them to return in November 1889. They completed their Attica and Peloponnese documentations and then headed to the north. They recorded the monuments in Arta. Here you see Monevassia, Mistras, and here is Panagia Parigorítissa in Arta. They And then they chose to travel down to Athens and take a boat to Thessaloniki. And here is a panorama of Thessaloniki during the period, instead of traveling eastwards by land. Key among the readings before departure, as well as during their stay, was George Finlay's History of Greece. The multi-volume work was published in 1877 in a revised edition by Reverend Tozer, the Oxford classicist and tutor at Exeter College. Tozer was a friend, a close friend in fact, of Morris. The emphasis on the unbroken line of the Greek nation, masterfully expressed in the wake of the Palmyra affair, also by Konstantinos Paparigopoulos in his voluminous History of the Greek Nation, must have greatly influenced them and saved, as a result, the material and method of their study. After a brief recording of classical antiquities, they systematically focused on the recording of Byzantine and post-Byzantine remains in the Greek mainland and the Alps as well. And I'm showing you here their documentation of the St. Andrew's Chapel in the Agia Philothei Monastery here in Athens. Unfortunately, the church was demolished, as you see here, in 1990. We have a photo, notebook, a final inked drawing, a plan, and of course here you see elevation and sections of this very building, which unfortunately hasn't survived. And I've got another example, Kesariani Monastery, again here in Attica. They recorded the architecture of the building, which dates to, as you can see, the 12th century. It's a Byzantine church, and also the decoration that dates, it's post-Byzantine, dates to the 17th and the 18th centuries. The color drawing that you see here is a reproduction also by French painters of the period. The result of their endeavor is unique and exceptionally valuable. In fact, it is an archival resource on Byzantine monuments known as the Byzantine Research Fund archive. I mean, Amalia Kakissis is the one who can give you more information about that. The archive is kept here at the British School. It was created between 1888 and 1949, and it consists of approximately 1,500 drawings and 1,000 photographs. They have recorded more than 50 surviving and non-surviving monuments. The archive also contains their notebooks, their correspondence, and their corporate records, which are particularly valuable. During both their visits, the two architects were housed at the British School. The British School at Athens was founded only 2 years before their arrival. It greatly facilitated their work by providing not only a reliable base in Athens with accommodation and access to a growing library, but also the particularly valuable resource of other British School members and their networks. Medieval, Byzantine archaeology and folklore studies would later flourish at the school. Clear goals were set out for the research. You must do it intelligently. You must try and get underneath the surface to discover the reasons for doing things as they did. Do not merely make pretty superficial sketches or even measure drawings to scale. The latter are valuable as historical records, but they won't teach you how to build honestly, reasonably, efficiently, and thus beautifully. This is Schultz, Weir Schultz, in his first reasoning building lecture at Carpenter's Hall in 1909. The majority of the period's traveler scholars, as we have already seen, were working in their recordings jointly with artists. Weir Schultz and Barnsley, although they would occasionally succumb to somewhat more artistic practices, would produce themselves originally preliminary and final drawings. These were based on close in situ observation, the photographs that they had produced themselves, and exhaustive notebook entries that they consistently kept throughout their traveling expeditions. And here you see the documentation of the Church of Hagia Theodori here in Athens by the French André Cousseau for his book, Soir des Églises, Greek, and it dates to the 1842. And for the same monument, Schultz produced a preliminary drawing. We have the notebook entry, a final inked drawing, a colored drawing, and a photograph. And we have also a comparative study of the windows of the building. It is Hagia Theodori and various other Athenian churches. Although not always accurate in all their details, these drawings demonstrate clear expertise and a genuine concern for consistent, accurate documentation. Both arrived in Greece well prepared. They had considered carefully and consulted regularly during their stay key studies of the period on Byzantine art and architecture, taking notes and copying extracts that most interested them in their notebooks. Principal among these studies were the first monographs devoted on Byzantine heritage in Greece and the Eastern Mediterranean. And you see here a selection of these studies. Schultz and Barnsley regularly consulted these. They were in fact their handbooks, you can say, and they were carrying them with them during their travels. However, these left them greatly dissatisfied. They felt these to be vague, inaccurate, and focusing on artistic impressions rather than architectural precision. Also, and what is more important in fact for them, they considered crucial that these studies offered a misleading interpretation of Byzantium and its art. The artistic production of the Byzantines was interpreted in these books as a more or less random combination of traditional classical and new elements. Schultz and Barnsley would read Byzantine art and architecture differently, as, and the quote comes from Barnsley's notebook 5, the result of the understanding and appropriation of only what is necessary from other people's art and other times. For the arts and crafts followers, the most obvious demonstration of the Byzantine builder's skill in appropriating and transforming tradition was the use of the arts, the vault, and the dome. Schultz and Barnsley would produce hundreds of measured preliminary sketches, as well as photographs and final inked drawings, studies in fact, of what they described in their notebooks as the classical columns lesson to carry in arts. And here you see a preliminary drawing by Schultz from his notebook, and another one by Lethaby. In fact, their drawings are sketches, the first sketches for the Liverpool Cathedral, and you see this concern for the arts. They're quite identical too. The exploitation of Byzantine domical construction was central to the 19th century arts and crafts literature. John Ruskin devotes 4 chapters of his tomes to the analysis of the Byzantine arts and capital. Lethaby, in his architecture, describes the early Christian vault as the ultimate building adventure and uses the emblematic image of the carved capital as the frontispiece of 2 of his major publications, Medieval Art and Architecture. For Schultz, who openly praises the French Auguste Saussy for his analysis of the building methods of the Byzantines exclusively in terms of the history of construction, and here you can see the influence, he considered his book, L'Art de Bâtir, as being one of the most important of the period. And you can see here that he was influenced by this very publication. So for Schultz, the vault and the dome illustrate the modern, as he calls it, in Byzantine art. That is, the ability to produce the maximum effect with economy, in the simplest way and with the least material. And here you see studies of Byzantine domes by Schultz and Barnsley. they sort of classified the Byzantine dome into two categories, and here you see plans and elevation section. So William Morris considered Byzantine art to be the best art ever produced by man. William Lethaby would read it as universal. Weir, for the first time, describes the Byzantine architecture as modern, emphasizing its practical possibilities. Byzantine architecture, however, had another very distinctive feature, which was equally fundamental to the arts and crafts' aesthetic values: delightful, fresh ornamentation. Following Morris, what characterized the Byzantine religious buildings is the organic interpenetration of construction, decoration, and design. Ruskin, in his tomes, had already stated that it is in the sweeping lines and broad surfaces of these Byzantine sculptures, that is the column of the capital, that we obtain for the first time in history of art the germ of the knife. The value of the architectural ornament and its role in the animation of the building, to use another tricky term used by the arts and crafts, was a key concept in the movement's philosophy. And it wouldn't have passed unnoticed by the British arts and crafts architects of the British School Archive. The richness of the ornamentation is always in harmony with the new building, underlines Barnsley. Both he and Weir would produce hundreds of drawings, not only of architectural sculpture, as you can see here, and ornaments in the Byzantine church, but also of floor, opus seculae, and it is interesting to have a look at the drawings they produced, the preliminary drawings they produced, in comparison with one of Ernest Gibson's designs for furniture inlays. I mean, they're quite close in their concepts, I believe. So they produced also floor opus seculae drawings, and of course wall decoration drawings, and mainly mosaics. Here you see the mosaics of the Daphne Monastery, and here mosaics from Ossos Lucas. They were particularly attracted, as you can see both here and in these reproductions, to the vertical and elongated ornamentation, as well as the slightly unfinished effect, the so-called non finito. This was essential to the arts and crafts aesthetic principles, geometry and the repetition of a geometrical design. In chapter 8 of Lethaby's architecture, we read, a distinction should be made between architecture as a method of building and as expressing thought and feeling through building. William Morris and Richard Lethaby would adopt the art of the Byzantines also for what they call its mysticism, the capacity to express subtle ideas. As Morris emphasized in his Working Men's College lecture, the ability to remind us of life after life. Weir and Barnsley seem to have been more pragmatic, adopting a more holistic approach. They would treat the Byzantine church as a whole, with architecture, decoration, and material objects subordinate to the creation of a sacred space that remained largely in use up until the modern times. According to Morris, the architectural space of the Byzantines was pure in its principles, reasonable in practice, and beautiful to the eyes of all men, even the simplest. Influenced by another of the core concepts of the arts and crafts aesthetics, the popular character of the art, they consistently recorded ecclesiastical furniture and liturgical objects that were still in use in church rituals. Their recordings are among the earliest of the kind. The systematic study, of course, of Greek folklore will follow, and demonstrates choral qualities and the meticulous care with which they worked on these objects. Weir and Barnsley shared the same zest for the task, as well as the same generous sponsor, the third Marquis of Bute, with Georgios Lambakis, a principal figure for the development of Byzantine studies in 19th century Greece, and founder of the Christian Archaeological Society. Lampakis, who served during the period as the personal secretary of Queen Olga, remaining in fact an outsider for the Greek academia throughout his career, undertook the tremendous task of recording between 1894 and 1907 Byzantine and post-Byzantine monuments and remains in the Eastern Mediterranean. The arts and crafts architects met and later partly collaborated with him while recording the monastic complexes of the monastic complex of the Phené. Now, the BRF architects, here you can see the Phené and Osios Lucas recordings of the two monasteries. In fact, the BRF architects, they were aiming to publish two major monuments, the monastery of the Phené and the monastery of Osios Lucas. Unfortunately, they managed to publish, as some of you already know, only the monastery of the Phené. The publication appeared in 1901. The range and diversity of Lampakis' recordings, his interest in contemporary liturgical practices, here you can see some of his recordings that attest to his interest in the church rituals during his time, seem to echo the Weir, Schultz, and Barnsley endeavor. However, what inspired Lampakis was a genuine, deeply romantic interest that aimed, in many ways, to emphasize the direct connection of the church to the newly founded Greek state and its people, underlining its appeal to the wider public. The scale of Lampakis' task and his devotion to it also characterized the French scholars of the period who were active in the region, in particular Gabriel Weir and Charles Weir. Their recordings, particularly those of Weir, who read, following the Austrian Joseph Strygovsky, the Byzantine churches of Attica as an argument against the theories of Fournier, seem to correspond to the predominant demand of rediscovering, reinventing in fact, the Byzantine and post-Byzantine past of Greece in an attempt by the official Greek state to remedy the so-far attitude toward the surviving Byzantine monuments and remains. And here in this memorandum, that it was composed for the newly founded capital of the newly independent Greek state, you can see that Byzantine monuments were in fact treated as, let's say, in fact, in juxtaposition to the classical past. The official government, in fact, was hoping to rebuild a classical new capital and not a Byzantine one. Weir, Schultz, and Barnsley did not meet with the friends. However, their students, Walter Sykes-George and William Harvey, who completed their Thessaloniki recordings, met personally with Weir and tried to arrange a meeting with Millet. The recordings of the two promising young architects, also members of the Royal Institute of British Architecture, complete the BRF archive's early group of records. Both were also nurtured by arts and crafts principles. George, in fact, had completed his training under Lethaby. Although he would later condemn Byzantine buildings as clumsy, he meticulously recorded, assisted by Harvey, the Thessaloniki Christian churches between 1907 and 1910. In fact, George was better than Weir, Schultz in his in situ recordings, but we need to take also into consideration that the political and the academic world in which he was active was different, rather different than that of Weir, Schultz. However, George managed to develop new recording methods, like the painted squeeze. He would press linen against the inscription for a more accurate result. And there you see his recordings of the now lost mosaics in the Church of St. Demetrius in Thessaloniki, maybe the most famous part of the Byzantine Research Archive. In his analysis of the building methods of the Byzantines on the occasion of the publication of the Church of St. Irene in Constantinople, George corroborated with Alexander van Milden. In the preface of the book, he elaborates on Weier's radical reading of the Byzantine construction method. He actually claims that the Byzantine builders were led to adopt so bold a method, not only by the motive of economy, a characteristic of the building methods of the Byzantines, emphasized also by Lethaby and Weir, but also by the wish for greater freedom in planning. So for George, another very distinctive characteristic of the Byzantine artistic production was the ability of the Byzantine architect to break free from established rules and press forward. George's and Harvey's Thessaloniki recordings did not pass unnoticed by the arts and crafts artists. John Philhellenism, the painter and arts and crafts painter, in fact, stained glass painter, who continued Mabel Esprin's work on the stained glass windows of the Anglican Cathedral in Khartoum, reproduced a series of Harvey's recordings of the dome mosaic in the Church of St. Sophia in 1922-23. Here you see photographs, exterior and interior photographs of the Church of St. Sophia. During the period, of course, all the Thessaloniki churches were functioning as mosques. But in fact, the mosaic survived in a pretty good state because, the Ottoman authorities, they just whitewashed the walls. And in the case of St. Sophia, the dome mosaic, in fact, was left untouched. So even Weir obviously had the opportunity to have a look at the mosaic. And here you see Harvey's reproduction, later reproduction. The photographs were by Weir at Barnsley. The drawing is by Harvey, and there you see the reproduction by John Philhellenism. And I have a detail which is pretty okay. Well, as you can see, the vivid colors and the rough outlines of Philhellenism's reproductions almost disfigure the original forms. Obviously, this was her way to interpret the freedom of design that characterizes the animated Byzantine mosaics, according again to the arts and crafts reading. Strangely enough, or maybe not, Weir is the architect who designed the Anglican Cathedral at Khartoum. As their mentor Lethaby had aspired, true to the original purpose of their travels, the BRF architects went on to use their research and skills as the backbone of their professional careers. George's and Harvey's subsequent projects do not betray any direct Byzantine influences. George worked in India as a resident architect in charge of the reconstruction of New Delhi. Harvey was involved in the rescue of historic buildings back in England. However, Weir and Barnsley are behind some of the earliest manifestations of the arts and crafts expression of Byzantium during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Sidney Barnsley, before devoting himself exclusively to furniture making, in partnership with his brother and Ernst Gimson, a very famous arts and crafts furniture designer, he was commissioned in 1891 by Freshfield and Sir Cosmo Bonso to design a church for their parish in Lower Kensington. The squat brick building it was dedicated to the holy wisdom of God, and interestingly enough, it was modeled on the plan of St. Irene in Constantinople. Now, I say interestingly enough because the Church of St. Irene, the decoration, the apse decoration that survives in the church, dates to the iconoclastic period. And in fact, George, in his church, he sort of copied that. Obviously, he knew because he had read about Byzantine art, so he knew that this is an iconoclastic motif, the cross in the apse, rather than the Virgin. And he reproduced that in his church. So they would sort of rehabilitate, they would appropriate all periods of Byzantine art, even iconoclasm. Byzantine iconoclasm was for them a part of the art of Byzantium, which is very interesting. So the church was modeled on the plan, and of course it also records the decoration of the Church of St. Irene in Constantinople. And also it betrays a strong Byzantine influence on specific features, especially on the brickwork. And this was also noticed, as you can see here, by Weir Schultz. Weir Schultz, he praises, here is the Church of the Holy Wisdom, designed by George, and there you see a photograph and a drawing of the Church of Agios Vasilios, St. Basil, in Arta. I think that it bears strong similarities to the Church of the Holy Wisdom. Certainly the Arta churches, we know that they fascinated them because of their brickwork designs, as you can see here, and St. Basil, Agios Vasilios, is one of the most interesting examples. However, one of the most successful applications of the lessons learned from the Byzantine architecture and art by the arts and crafts pioneers was the Anglican church designed by Weir Schultz, the Khartoum Cathedral, between 1906 and 1923. Usually, his contributions to Bentley Westminster Cathedral are considered as demonstrating his Byzantinism. These, however, are part of a Neo-Byzantine class that in fact failed to demonstrate his true practical and conceptual knowledge of Byzantium. Here I'm showing you just one example. The stalls in the cathedral, they bear strong similarities with Greek furniture in the churches that they have noticed, photographed, and recorded. The Anglican Cathedral, however, attests to the opposite. In fact, the project gave Weir Schultz the opportunity to apply in practice what he himself described as the main lesson of the Byzantine masters: the appropriation of existing local and traditional construction methods in a practical architecture, beautiful, true to the materials, and evocative of ideas. The plan, as you can see here, at Transept Basilica, mirrors the Thessaloniki Church of St. Demetrius. And again, here you see recordings of the Church of St. Demetrius, and here is the Anglican Cathedral with the transept. The masonry is Greek. The rosette above the entrance, I hope that you can see it here. It records the standard decoration of Romanesque and Gothic buildings. Inspiration for the stained glass might have been drawn, as we have seen, from the mosaics of the Thessaloniki Church of St. Sophia, and local materials were used for the furniture. Actually, the furniture were commissioned from Gimson and Barnsley in the Cotswolds. The decoration and design were inspired by Weir Schultz and Barnsley's Greek records. In sum, the Anglican Cathedral is a traditionally modern building that evokes Byzantium, Europe, and the East, appropriating in part what Lethaby reads as a universal style. So we've got so far universal, popular, easily accessible, an adventure, in fact Lethaby would say the ultimate adventure, honest, reasonable, economical, inspiring, full of life, symbolic, modern, beautiful. This is how the British arts and crafts pioneers revisited, rehabilitated in fact, the art of Byzantium. Ahead of their time, they focused on the Eastern Mediterranean, Greece in particular, bringing through it the Byzantine world into the forefront of contemporary consciousness. They were, in fact, the first of a series of avant-garde artists who would look back into Byzantium for inspiration. Their reading could not have been unbiased. Certainly, it was influenced by their arts and crafts background, their arts and craft principles, and their ethos. However, it still remains a most radical interpretation of a past historical period, very rarely identified with modernism. And it still challenges, I believe, the way, why and how we tend to look or avoid looking at Byzantium. Thank you.